Welcome to Blackbird, episode number 27. My name is James, and today I am thrilled to bring to you an interview with LB Muniz. LB is one of my very favorite people to talk to. I've been on his show before, and I'll make sure to link to that episode in the show notes. His show, the Been Awake podcast for Better Sensemaking, explores sort of the antidote to wokeness. LB and I don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything, which is probably a good thing. I don't even see eye to eye with myself on everything from time to time. So we have really good conversations because we're both very open-minded. We're both kind of on the skeptical side and like to ask questions of the various worldviews and even our own worldviews that we come across. So I think you're going to really enjoy this interview. Before we get into the interview, let me remind you about BU Enterprises. My good friend Juliet is ready and waiting to welcome you back into your body through online yoga classes, Pilates, posture exercises, and just teaching you how to be aware of what's going on physiologically and emotionally in your body. She can help you on your way to physical and mental health. Check out BU Enterprises at buenterprises.com and let them know that I sent you. And with that, here is my interview with LB Muniz. LB Muniz, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to continuing our conversation.
Yeah, man. Our interview on my own feed has gotten pretty good listenership, which is kind of, it was a repost from your feed. So that was pretty interesting that it got more listens than I would say some of my bigger name guests. So
that makes me happy.
Yeah, it sounds like people like to hear from us. So that's cool. For those of the audience who don't know you, why don't you kind of introduce yourself?
Yeah. So, I'm LB Muniz. I walk the path of the philosopher. I started writing about 7 or 8 months ago, been in this liberty space for a long time. And I try to teach skepticism as like an academic discipline and just really try to interact with the world as it is and try to give people workable advice in a newsletter that I release 5 days a week. So it's related to liberty, but one thing interesting that happens is like, I keep running into people be like, oh, another libertarian podcast. And I have some ideas on that we should get into. But I don't really consider my show a libertarian podcast. I consider my show, somebody who has libertarian politics maybe, but it's a show of exploration and it's a show of what I think philosophy should be, which is kind of practical advice with some heady overtones. So, if you're interested, you can go to beenawake.com and subscribe with your email address. And that's the best way to kind of interact with what I'm putting out there into the world.
Yeah, your pitch for just subscribe with your email address. I'm gonna have to copy that because I'm getting a lot more subscribes with the click of your button than with your email address on Substack. And I would like to be kind of driving my traffic that way, especially as we talked about the last time we talked, with more and more written content coming out. Just subscribing to the podcast is probably not good enough for me. So how did you get into this? Where'd you come from?
Like intellectually speaking?
Intellectually and also like just kind of your background.
Yeah. So, I moved around a lot growing up. So I was born in Washington, D.C. I know, ooh, scary. I was born in Washington, D.C. I lived in Maryland, New Jersey, Maryland, Wisconsin in Illinois before I was 7 years old. Basically been in the western suburbs for my whole life. And my intellectual tradition, it's twofold, right? It's both sides of my family. There's the Cuban side and then the Irish side. The Cuban side, obviously, has this very anti-communist, right? My grandparents literally escaped Fidel's regime. My grandfather would have died in the Cuban military. I have members of my extended family who have been killed by the Cuban government. So really saying F you to communists has been a huge part of my intellectual tradition. And then on the other side, more of a traditional American kind of constitutional upbringing, big fans of Reagan. But then, my grandmother on that side of the family was a big, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I learned a recent story, kind of a funny story about the Chicago Machine of how my great grandfather on my Irish side of the family he was like living with an uncle who was a political boss, but they voted Republican, and he was a Democratic political boss. And they said, "Hey, listen, we heard that you voted for such and such a candidate. You can't do that and continue to live here." And so this is literally family members saying like, "Hey, you have to be a good person now and vote for the Democrats." So I've always been interested in philosophy. I probably take more of my cues from Plato, Socrates, Nietzsche, Aristotle than I do some of the great libertarian economists. But I don't know. And I just kind of started writing and doing a show because I feel like, because frankly, I look at a lot of people out there and I'm like, I think I can do as good of a job, if not a little bit better. So, and I'll let the audience decide to the extent that happens.
Yeah, well, I tend to binge your episodes rather than listen to them as they come out, because they're kind of chock full. So I want to make sure I can like give them my attention that they deserve rather than doing them while I'm doing other stuff, like driving. You describe yourself as a skeptic, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
So I've been working on different definitions for this in a practical sense. So for a long time, if you go through a philosophy class and you study skepticism, you're going to learn of like the word ataraxia, or you're going to learn about the idea of the study of doubt or the withholding of assent, which are very lofty terms. I'm putting that recently, and might have even been on our interview that I first put it out there, but inquiry before dogma. That really sums up kind of what I'm trying to do. In particular, there's a book on my shelf that deals with the Hellenistic age of ancient Greece. And what you basically see is the rising of the Third Academy. And the Third Academy was kind of where you see this discipline of academic skepticism come into play. So I don't mean skepticism in this, the world is a phantasm, although I've kind of been playing with that idea recently. It's the recognition that I might be wrong about anything that I have. And it's about building the best case for anything that I'm going to agree to. And there's also the larger meta story, if you will, is I think there's at least two ways to do everything. And a lot of times there might be three or four. And so if we look at skepticism, there's skepticism in like a biological sense, if you will. So there's skepticism in like, oh, I'm just going to disagree with what people are saying because I'm curious about this, I'm questioning this. And then there's a difference between actually turning that into a school of thought. And I'm a big believer in conceptualizing things in terms of like a school of thought. So basically, to make it simple, is, in the Hellenistic age, you had the Stoics and the Epicureans. The Stoics were a lot about divine providence, the idea that, you have no control over your life, but you have control over your judgment. You don't even have, under like an Epictetus or other Stoics, you wouldn't even have control over your own body in a sense, but you have control over your mind and judgment of things. And the Epicureans were this very materialist, Epicurus was about the maximization of pleasure because this is all there is. And so like, we should just try and be as happy and, and do whatever you want, do what makes you happy, do what brings you pleasure. And then you had, I think it would be Pyrrho would be the guy, Pyrrhonian skepticism. I could be wrong on this. But basically, you had this Third Academy that arose. And, so if you think about it, Plato had the first, Aristotle had the second, this would be the third. And the Third Academy was kind of about debating both of these people and kind of saying, well, look, you're both kind of saying the same thing. And you're both saying completely different things. And yet you can both coexist. You can both work within the world. And I think there's much to the chagrin of anybody who would find themselves in one of those schools of thought, or one of the schools of thought we deal with today. You can find success. Right? People, if we're going to put this into the modern parlance, if you want to go like progressive versus libertarian or socialist versus libertarian, there are plenty of socialists who find success. And I don't think, or, religious people would think that atheists can't find success or can't find happiness as such. And skepticism, I think, there's the practical thing of like, okay, you learn how to think better. I've kind of realized that I've trained my brain at this point to just doubt everything that I immediately come across. And I have to go through like 5 or 6 arguments before I can actually put something out. So there's like that practical aspect of it, but then there's the larger implications where I do think that skepticism is what drives society forward in a sense, because it takes, after you reach a certain level, we've discussed integral theory, so I think your audience would be kind of familiar with that. But once you reach a certain level, a certain state of an idea, there comes a point where skepticism is almost required, I would say. And it's that skepticism that kind of propels, you might say, propels humanity forward if you want to put, a narrative on the history of humanity like that.
So a lot of that sounds like it takes a lot of time. I mean, are there any heuristics or just like shortcuts that you take when it comes to like I hear something and I question it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where, so I think I definitely incorporate both that natural inclination to question everything, which I think a lot of us in this podcasting space probably have. So I kind of always, my parents, I'm sure, would say that I was always like a contrarian, or I always questioned things or asked too many, maybe asked too many questions at times. And I think as a result of that, you do develop necessary heuristics. So if we look to previous schools, you have like Sextus Empiricus. This is all again in the Hellenistic age. But Sextus Empiricus, one of his rules, because if we can't know anything for certain, if there is no such thing as an absolute truth, if there is no such thing as the world, reality, whatever we might want to say, okay, well, what can you do with that? And one thing that he talked about was reliance on custom. Now, I don't necessarily share that, but I'm also writing, like 1,000 years after he was, let's say, maybe longer. But I think in a heuristic sense, this is why I look at schools of thought. And I think I look at it this way. There are people who want to take the journey, and then there are people who just want the answers. And in like a religious sense, that's what religion does. Is religion kind of gives you the answers already prepackaged. Here you go. There's no wavering. This is what we're doing. Whereas philosophy is the counter melody, where we're kind of questioning, kind of following, and seeing what works in the world as such, and then questioning what works in the world. So I think the real answer to this is you find a school of thought that works for you, and you make sure that it holds up to your perception and to kind of how you see things. Because frankly, it is an arduous task. And it's something that as I've progressed in my career, this is really interesting, of where I've kind of developed more of those heuristics. Once I was out of that academic world and in a very practical world, like I went from academia to manufacturing, right? So there really is no room. There is no room to question things, right? There is a way that things can get done, and there is a way that steel is made in a certain way. And these are the settings, and this is the answer. And I think that helped me. And then just to close that off too, I think there's a natural, maybe American pragmatism to it as well. I studied like William James, and I wrote a paper once about how, what's better, Nietzsche, who's better, Nietzsche or William James? And I kind of argued in the paper that Nietzsche probably has the best answers, but not everybody can really deal with the answers that Nietzsche has for people. So William James, who says like, the truth is whatever works, this larger American pragmatic school of thought, I think that's, I don't know. I think that's kind of another answer is, okay, this seems to work. So let me roll with this for a while maintaining the idea that I could be wrong about a set of ideas that I have.
Dig into that a little bit. I have a passing familiarity with Nietzsche because I took a course at Thad Russell's Renegade University, and I have heard of William James before, but I don't know anything about him. Can you kind of compare and contrast them a little bit?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, they wrote it, I think William James would come afterwards, and William James was a psychologist, I believe, first. And so I might have to go a couple steps higher than the specifics, but basically American pragmatism was the school of thought, and it's separate from, this is in philosophy, I like to say that we use words and particular meanings to mean particular things, right? And that's a lot of what philosophy is. So, this pragmatism doesn't mean like, oh, well, I'm just a pragmatic guy, so I'm going to take a little bit of column A, column B. No. Pragmatism was a school of thought that kind of arose at the beginning of the 20th century, which said that the truth is whatever works. So that's like the easiest schema. Whereas Nietzsche has much deeper ideas and talks a lot more about humanity as a whole. I think part of the reason why I wouldn't say that why for me, Nietzsche is a lot about recognizing that there is a herd in humanity and the herd mentality of humanity, and kind of realizing that there are people out there who have a different, who fundamentally perceive the world in a different way than you do, than we would, perhaps, I would say. And that's also natural. And so he talks a lot. Nietzsche kind of also points out a lot in like, he points out, let me pull this up because I just wrote about this past week. I actually put one of my favorite quotes of Nietzsche in a piece I did about, regulating human behavior in a simulation. So he has this brilliant line about the realists. this is one of those things that when I heard it, we talked about the death of God in our show together, which people should definitely check out.
Mm-hmm.
But this was one that when I heard it, I'm like, holy cow, I'm in for a whole new set of ideas kind of being forced into my brain. So this is a response to realism. And you might also say that realism is materialism. So, Marxists would very much be caught up in this sort of idea. A lot of socialists would as well. But I also think, interestingly enough, some of the more constructionist people would as well, right? Like, oh, well, every gender is a social construct. Okay. Maybe that doesn't answer what we think it does. So this is the quote. And it goes, every feeling and sensation contains a piece of this old life, and some fantasy, some prejudice, some unreason, some ignorance, some fear, and ever so much else has contributed to it and worked on it. That mountain there, that cloud there, what is real in that? Subtract the phantasm and every human contribution from it, my sober friends, if you can. If you can forget your descent, your past, your training, all of your humanity and animality, there is no reality for us. Not for you either, my sober friends. And so the line, subtract the phantasm of and every human contribution from it, is another way of saying that is, if you remove everything that has been said about a mountain, what's real about a mountain? That's Nietzsche.
Yeah.
William James would be a little more along the lines of, well, a man is entitled to, he has a bit about a man should be entitled to his religious beliefs, but a man should also be entitled to a holiday from discovering every last little answer. Which is kind of to say, like, listen, you can believe in God, Allah, you could believe in the God of the New Testament, Old Testament, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, you could believe in a larger idea of consciousness in like Buddhism, but you can also not decide, you can kind of decide to not have any answers on that and not actually figure out every last little thing about it. While at the same time, you can work, right? You can earn a living, you can have a family, and you can still be a good person without having all of these things tied up. So in the idea of pragmatism, again, truth isn't necessarily, it's not what the skeptics say, which is that if a truth exists, we can't necessarily know it, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's not to say there is no truth. That's nihilism, and nihilism is boring, people listening. And so it's not that there is no truth. It's not that we can't necessarily know whether there is an objective truth. It's like, if it works, then that is actually true. Now, there were problems with this because a lot of people at the early 20th century in the light of this were saying, well, we have this scientific mindset to the idea of government, and that seems to work, right? So, there's dark and light to all of this, but that would be my best way of, hopefully that made sense, because it's been a while since I've thought about that paper that I wrote a long time ago, but sure. I could probably pull it up.
The Nietzsche quote and then your analogy of the mountain reminds me a little bit of the Catholic and Orthodox, and to a lesser extent Anglican doctrine of transubstantiation in the Eucharist, where the bread and wine aren't symbolizing Jesus's body and blood, but they actually become it, even though they look like the bread and wine or the cracker and grape juice or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. By saying the words over that bread and wine, the priest, through the Holy Spirit, actually turns the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And it kind of gets down to the Aristotelian concepts of the accidents and the essence and the substance of the matter, mm-hmm. or the spiritual nature of it, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you said in philosophy we use words to mean particular things. What about the evolution of language? I mean, gender obviously is sort of the hot button thing right now, mm-hmm. where we're seeing a separation between the word sex and the word gender, where one is a biological reality and the other one is a subjective feeling, I guess.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a good thing or a bad thing? Or
I think linguistic drift is inevitable, but I do think that there's a few different ways to answer this. I think that linguistic drift is inevitable. So there will be changing meanings over time, changing spellings, different understandings. And that's, again, so I was told once, I think I was reading Kant, and my professor said, good philosophy is trying to change the way that you think. and it's trying to like change the way that you process information. And that's one of the reasons why it can be so confusing. So there's the philosophical realm, and then there's kind of the practical realm, and then there's the political realm, and there's the we can keep subdividing this. I do think that one thing that I like about philosophy in general is that it has the ability to kind of cross through. It kind of rejects this, in my mind at least, it rejects this like Germanic notion that we must have like very individualized knowledge found in one person, right? It's not that you study the classics, it's that you study the classics between 1950 or 1836 and 1836.5. And that, that's going to be your area of expertise. Yeah. I have always taken more of a total view of things, which is why, like if you talk to some people, I probably wouldn't be considered that great. But, like I said, I'm here doing what I can. As it relates to the gender and sex in particular, have I written about this yet? No. Have I? Yes, actually I have. So I've been trying to take, Jordan Peterson would talk a lot about these studies of how, in the Nordic countries, differences between men and women seem to maximize, even though they've adopted the most egalitarian policies. I've studied other people, who argue determinism or biological, fundamentalism, maybe some would call it. I wouldn't call it that. But this question of nature and nurture, maybe to put it a different way, is like perennial. And I do think that there's a case to be made for both. And I don't think it's one exclusive thing. I think it's a mixture of the both. Okay, that's not really interesting. What is interesting? Well, how does that relate to sex and gender? And how does that relate linguistically? This isn't any final thoughts, but it's an interesting thing to ponder of like, my understanding of the English language in part is that it has been highly influenced by, it traces, its roots are Germanic in origin. And then there's also French roots as well. So so like the Romantic languages. And if you look at our words and where they come from, the fancy sounding words, so gender, anything with more than one syllable actually has its roots in more of like a Romantic language, a Latin language, French in particular. And then a word like sex actually comes from like a Germanic word. I'm sure there'll be more that kind of come to me as we go on. But like fire and flame, I mean, that's mutton or pork or pork or bovine or what would that be? Beef or bovine. Yeah. There used to be I used to have a lot more of these offhand. But as it relates to sex and gender, we have this. The real question is, to what extent are we talking about something that's real, so to speak? And to what extent are we talking about differences in definitions? And so I see that at the root of a lot of the questions here. And I think, but the broader point, I do think that we are so rich as a society that to where we don't even, I think those of us who have grappled with economics understand this a little bit better. But if you haven't grappled with economics, and specifically the type of economics that deals more with like human behavior, so the Austrian school, broadly speaking, you don't quite appreciate the richness that exists, the level of wealth that exists in today's world versus a couple of hundred years ago. So let's take, for example, the larger scope of individuals, because I am an individualist fundamentally, individuals who don't fit within the standard gender paradigm. So a man and a woman make a baby, that's society. There are, and this is something that the gender activists do a disservice, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. For sourcing on this, there was a great show called Taboo that National Geographic put out like 15 years ago. That's amazing, and is frankly probably one of those things that I look back on and see it as very formulating to like how I look at things, because they just kind of address. It was literally like, let's look at every cultural taboo. So there's for example, the two-spirit. That's one example of it. And then another one would be the Fahini, the Fahini in, I think in the Samoa, in some Pacific island country. Now, the Fahini do not consider themselves women, but they are men who live and operate as women in a very, tribal and traditional mindset, right? So they kind of help with the child rearing. They help with like cleaning. They do these sorts of things. Two-spirit is more of a recognition of the idea that a holy person encompasses more than just strict masculinity or strict femininity. And in fact, they actually cross between. And then there would be a third one that I would point out that I can't think of the name, but it's in India. And these are the historical instances that you can look and say, see, our Western conceptualization of gender is so limited, and look at all these places. The third one in India were men who lived as women and would like castrate themselves willingly as a member of it. And then there was a specific deity.
I think it's the Hydra.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds right. And so there would be, we take these kind of three things, and I think the spiritual one you have to throw out, because if we're going to talk about spirituality and the beyond, and you're going to try and cram it into this modern conversation of gender, I think that's being disingenuous. I think what a shaman or a Sha woman or a two-spirit was trying to accomplish by being the holy person of the tribe. This is, in a Christian sense, by the way, this would be the Holy Spirit, right? The whole and the idea of 3 in 1. You have this in Christianity too. It's just not always talked about it in the proper context. And Catholicism, it gets more complicated with the idea of Mary. But let's just take the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. This is a mystery you're supposed to reflect on in the faith. This is really what I think that these ancient tribes, in that I understand it, are actually talking about as it relates to somebody who moves beyond gender. So that's kind of a different thing than than like the practical aspect. So now we're left with the Fahini and we're left with the Hydra. I think the Hydra is probably most analogous to what we're dealing with today, because because you can also, in Albania, there was a practice of women foregoing the marriage and living as a man so that they could inherit property rights. And that's kind of what we see in the Fahini as well. It's a kind of like, okay, we kind of have this thing where there's a lot more men being born than women on this island.
Wow.
Some of these men are obviously gay because, right? So they kind of develop this third role for them that works within their society. And so, and again, these people, they wouldn't be considered trans in a Western interpretation, but you will see these activists. Using that as fodder, right? So I think the Hydra is probably closer to what we're actually dealing with, which my understanding is kind of happened in like the big cities and basically a very developed society for the time, which is to say, in a developed society tends to be richer, right? And so I think there's a richness to where we live today. So let's bring it back to today, where if you want to experiment, you actually have the luxury to experiment with your gender identity, so-called, right? You actually have the luxury today, and more so in 2021 than in 2001, absolutely. But even in 2001 and in 1980, there was more than in 1856 or in 1650 or in 30 AD. And so I think that's the part that people aren't discussing, because from like a left-wing perspective, it doesn't make sense to discuss how wonderfully rich we are, that we have this problem to deal with. And I think in some respects, we've moved beyond the idea of first world problems a little too quickly, because first world problems actually put things into context. And what the people in power want to do today is put them into racial problems and gender problems to then divide people, because it's not about understanding, it's about control.
Yeah, I think that's where the danger lies. I mean, obviously, I'm gay, and I'm really glad that I was born in 1982 and not 1922, because it allows me to live the life that like my body wants me to live.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I'm also constantly, well, I guess not constantly, but I'm a heretic inside of that sort of subcultural orthodoxy, because obviously I don't buy into the woke stuff, and I have lots of transgender friends, and so I totally buy into the sex and gender bifurcation, but I don't like the authoritarianism that comes with it. Do you think it's a normal thing, or is it something that's kind of unique to America or the West in 2021, that as cultures become more individualist, where my gender identity might not match the like general, maybe something like 98% of people, 99% of people, their gender and their sex match, and so you can make a generalization on that. But if my particular gender identity doesn't match my sex, then I don't fit that generalization. And that's definitely something that I think that a sensitive person should take into account when dealing with me as an individual. So that's what I mean by an individualist culture.
Mm-hmm.
But we are becoming more collectivist politically, and with collectivist politics, it's necessarily more authoritarian, I think. Do you think that that's a normal thing in like the history of political and cultural evolution, or is it something that's unique to now?
I think the part that's unique to now are the means by which we can do it, and not even the means by which people in power can assert control. Because there is one thing, going back to the skeptical idea, right? One interesting thing that I kind of came upon accidentally in my ruminations early on was kind of this realization that if you read old philosophy, a lot of them aren't dealing with the political day-to-day. Why? Because there were kings. And so that was for kings to decide. And then there was this separate area of how you should live the best life. Today, for reasons that I would maybe a few years ago have said were stupid, but now kind of understanding this biological impulse, and if we look at politics as a manifestation of biology, it kind of makes more sense. I think the method of control has extended and become more difficult, or become more pervasive, right? Which is where that's really what's different. Because if you look back at different histories and time periods where there were issues, you will see the same types of arguments happening. And I recently wrote a piece. All this has happened before, and all this would happen again, kind of in relation to the the vaccine passports conversation. And what I didn't even realize, and this is me being a bad person, I guess, but I knew it from Battlestar Galactica. Turns out it's actually First Ecclesiastes, and it's this very deep idea of what is knowledge good for, and it's also encompassing the idea is there is a time for all things. But all this has happened before. All this will happen again. There is nothing new under the sun. I like the show Ancient Aliens, and I think that's a marker of an open mind as somebody who likes the show Ancient Aliens. And I was recently rewatching their early ones because Jason Stapleton had pointed out that they're a very good way of looking at how to use influence to try and present an alternative case for something. And it kind of just opens your mind. If I think it's a mark of the type of mind that we're dealing with too. And so one thing as it relates to the trans issue is how small we're actually going as far as what percentage of the population we're attempting to, if you like, integrate. And this isn't unique to me. Jordan Peterson has talked about this in the whole conceptualization of, okay, if I'm talking to you, I'm going to try and be, I will not even try to be. I'm naturally very deferential and kind, and I'm not here to make you feel bad about who you are, and I hope you're not here to make me feel bad about who I am. And we're having an open dialogue. But then other people are going to listen to this. So if I'm talking to 5 people, can I offend one of them? If I'm talking to 100 people, can I offend one of them? And the problem with the victim culture that the political class and the universities, if you will, have inculcated in people is that this victim mentality, which is like an inversion of honor culture, because again, there's nothing new under the sun. This mentality is actually manifesting itself in such a way that, okay, well, I can't offend anybody, so I'm just going to shut up. And then now we see as a consequence of that radicalization of political thought. And to maybe make it a little too simplistic, right? But I think that's what I worry about, because it's one of those things that we can sit here and talk for over an hour and maybe come to some kind of a conclusion. But to what extent can that be mainstreamed? And I think that's where you see a lot of people who would otherwise not take the historical look and just be like, well, no, I'm not going to deal with this stuff. And I'm a single guy, and I even see it. It's even it's not as strict as just the LGBTQ community, because it's mainstreamed. At least I'm outside of Chicago. It's mainstreamed into here to where it's like, oh well, I'm a queer pansexual. Can we admit that maybe we're going a little far of this? But again, this is where I think. But then I respond to that in my mind of, well, this is the question of identity. And what does identity mean in the 21st century, where you can literally be if you have enough presence of mind, you could be what you want to be. We have that. We have the technology, right? It's a complicated issue, and people make it too simple when they bring it into politics.
Queer pansexual. That reminded me of something I saw on Twitter the other day, and this is a complete sidebar, and we're not going to dig into it. But I saw someone who identifies with they/them pronouns, but they describe themselves as a bisexual, which to me that's almost like a contradiction. Like if you're going to use they/them, then you should at least go all the way and call yourself a pansexual. Like,
right.
And maybe obviously this person probably hasn't put thought into what they were saying in their Twitter bio.
Mm-hmm. This has just gotten so this is where like Nietzschean thought really, if you're willing to take the ride, this is what's going on. There is a herd, and there are multiple herds, and there are people who follow, and there are people who lead. And then there are people who are outside of that paradigm a little bit, but not by much. So there are many people who are just manifesting what they think is what they should be, and they don't question it. If you want the best iteration of this is in The Devil Wears Prada. Where Anne Hathaway is sitting there and she's saying, well, I just bought this at Marshall's or whatever thing. And her name is escaping me. She played the Iron Lady. Meryl Streep.
Yeah, Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep, thank you. And then Meryl Streep says, that's cerulean blue. We did cerulean blue 15 years ago in this catalog. And she kind of goes about and she looks at, she traces in a very short period of time how that particular shade of blue made it all the way to Anne Hathaway, who thought that she was rejecting the fast fashion industry. And so once you accept the idea that there are people who are trying to influence and move public opinion or the individual mind on a massive level, a lot of things start to make more sense than they did before. And understanding that for a lot of people, this is the same thing of if you were raised in a time where everyone went to church on Sunday, you would go to church on Sunday, right? There is a huge corollary if you read works from like the scientific revolution in particular, because this is where you start to see the change in language, where there is a lot of deference paid to the Christian religion, to Catholicism, largely speaking, to the teachings of the gospel. But at the same time, okay, so we're going to pay homage, but then we're going to talk science for a little bit. And we see the same kind of thing happening now in modern circles. We're like, well, listen, obviously we have to, we need to incorporate marginalized voices. I, as a white cis heteronormative man, shouldn't really be talking right now, and yet here I am, and I'm going to do my mea culpa so that I can have a say in this field. Or I'm going to take the notion that I shouldn't have a say in this field, but guess who I do get to have a say with my white cis heteronormative family, and so I get to preach to them this message. And it's people pick up ideas and run with them. I don't think it's the case, again, there's nothing new under the sun, that we're all necessarily as unique as we'd like to believe.
Ecclesiastes is my favorite book of the Bible, by the way. I think there's just so much there. And I think Turn, Turn, Turn by the Birds is like directly taken from it, which is also one of my favorite songs. A time to mourn, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to live, a time to die, a time to till the soil. Yeah. Well, and it gets into, it's even kind of integral to bring it back to that. There's a time for individualism and there's a time for collectivism as well.
Did you ever watch the Book of Eli?
No.
So this was a movie, early to mid 2000s, I think, maybe the late aughts, I think is what we're supposed to call it. But it was Samuel L. Jackson, and it's this post-apocalyptic world, and here he is, this badass walking across the country because God sent him on a mission to bring the Bible to go west. That was his understanding. And spoiler alert, it turns out he's blind, but he's like this awesome fighter. And then the Bible was a Braille Bible because they had burned all the Bibles before this. But he finally makes it basically people have taken that prisoner island. I don't know thank you, Alcatraz, and turned it into like a new library. Okay. So in the movie, his enemy is this guy who has built up a very useful town, a functioning town. right? Where they like ration water, and he's the one who controls the source of the water. Therefore, he's the one that controls the town. And when he hears Samuel L. Jackson's character praying, or really Mila Kunis is in the movie. So Mila Kunis does like a prayer, and he's like, whoa, where the hell did you learn how to pray? She's like, oh, well, this guy showed it to me. He's like, and he had a book where he said he learned it from. And so this guy, and this is like a really important thing that I think people need to grapple with. And that includes people in our space. Because this guy wanted the Bible. Why? Because he wanted to control people. And certainly, the best understanding of like the new atheist movement, I have a lot of criticisms with them. But, the best understanding of the new atheist movement, or just atheism in general, is this rejection of the rigidity of some of these Catholicism, Christianity, broadly speaking. I'll speak from that just because I'm a Western person, so I won't bother to get into how this changes in an Islamic context or in a Hinduistic context, what have you. But I can understand there's a lot wrong with it, but it basically deals with these issues of religion, and there is something to the story that religion is used to control people. Right? Ideally for the best of reasons, but not always. So this character wants to take over the world by using the words because he understands that those words have power. And one thing that I'm seeing right now in the reaction to this wokeism are people looking to talk about the Bible again, right? Jordan Peterson kind of started this in a broader sense, and it's a little worrisome because I'm kind of seeing it's like, because there is so much power to those kinds of words when we talk about them. And what I'm seeing people do is use them as a method of control and not as a method of understanding, because if for no other reason then they get that it makes more sense maybe to do that to get their way. I don't know. I don't have final thoughts on this, but this has been something that's bugging me, because it's like, oh, well, I'm going to look to Christianity for my answers. It's like, okay, but like, what is your Christianity? Is your Christianity that we're just going to instill order on the world? Right? It's like, okay, well, where do we run afoul when we do something like that? How was it that atheism could even come about if Christianity is this perfect understanding to everything? And I say this as somebody who considers himself nominally Christian, if not a practicing Catholic, right? Like I have a lot of love for these stories, and I'm not somebody who has ever rejected them. But that's why I say I walk the path of the philosopher. It's just, I don't necessarily take a religious outlook on all of this stuff. I don't know. How does that strike you? Because it's something that I'm a little worried about right now.
Yeah, I think Jordan Peterson and also Vin Armani, who recently came out with his book Render Unto Caesar, they've kind of done a good job of reframing Christianity, I guess. It's not so much the dogma and the doctrine of Christianity that they're looking at, as far as I'm concerned. It's more the logic of, well, I mean, the logic, first of all, of the Trinity, where, you've got the rules, like the rule maker is the Father, and then you've got the chaos. So you've got the order in the Father, you've got the chaos in the Holy Spirit, where, this is just God manifesting in the world, like free flowing. Literally, the word spirit in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin is the word for wind. And the holy wind is just wherever it blows. And then you've got the Word, the Son, Jesus, who makes sense of it all, the Logos. And to me, like, even if you don't believe in the resurrection, or even if you differ on issues of morality, which, obviously I think some of that stuff seems arbitrary and some of it seems a little hyper rigid, that particular thing, along with the narrative structure of the Bible, which a Catholic theologian named Scott Hahn is probably the best at this. He calls it salvation history, and how it goes from the Bible follows the path of man's relationship with God, from an individual to a couple to a family with Noah, to a tribe with Abraham, to a nation under the judges, to a kingdom under David, and then to the entire world under Christ in his kingdom, in his sort of universal Catholic relationship with the world.
Yeah.
So from sort of an intellectual standpoint, I think that Christianity, to me, has the best like structural underpinnings, if not truth with a capital T, I guess. And I mean, from a postmodern or even skeptical standpoint, I think that probably trying to identify truth is kind of fraught with potential problems.
And I think for me, that also manifests that could manifest itself in the way of, well, anybody who's going to question things, I need to label a heretic, right? And that's when you see this. That's what we're seeing right now. By the way, that is exactly what we are going through. We are going through a time where there will be heretics, and those heretics will be judged by the authority. This isn't to denigrate to the Catholic Church or any Christianity, but we're allegorical creatures. We're mimetic creatures. This is the best way I can explain it. This is the time we are heading into, which is, kind of dangerous when you and I are having this sort of a conversation, but here we are. But, so that's the time. So it can be manifested that way, which is kind of going after the individual. What I try to do, and what I would suggest other people try to do, is use those resources to people who have power. Right? Because the people who have power are the ones who deserve the most skepticism for what they're saying. And that would go for me at, where I'm at right now. And for me and you in 20 years when we've got a freaking media empire underneath us, right? I would expect people to kind of look at what I have to say with a lot of skepticism. And I recognize the fact that what I try to do in my show is build that level of trust to where you can say like, okay, hey, what I try to do is sense making, right? I'm trying to make sense of the world, and whatever larger ideas I might have, that's what I try to do in like a practical way every single day with something that, you can read while you're sitting on the toilet. I mean, and there's a lot of utility to that, I like to say reason is a double-edged sword, right? And so or if you want to borrow from the Tao, the yin yang, or, even again, the idea of the Trinity, there is a light and a dark. There is this turn to everything. Everything can be understood in a positive or a negative sense. And yeah, I get it that makes the world a complicated place. So, if you want to take the route of, well, I'm just going to follow this religion, which is what I see a lot, which is what a lot of people do, that's awesome. Then we have the atheism movement, largely speaking. And so people still have that same search for meaning. And what do they replace it with? Well, they're replacing it with the state. Such to the point now that, again, we're kind of seeing this whole thing where like, oh, we're just going to kind of, I don't know. It's this conflagration that we see in every instance. And there's the philosophical conversation that we're kind of having now, which is like, let's actually work through the issues, or try to. But then, the world can't sit around for us to figure it out. And the world hasn't sat around for us to figure it out throughout the eons, throughout the thousands of years of the Western tradition. You understand? So it's like, there is that point where you have to make action and you have to go and act in the world. So how do you do that? Well, okay, treat people with some deference, try to be understanding, but that kind of falls both, that again, it's a double-edged sword that falls both ways. So that would go for the person who's in the small town who maybe, to draw a very easy parallel, that the black family moves into an all-white neighborhood. It should follow for the white people in that neighborhood, and it should also follow that when some guy who grew up in a small town in Iowa comes to a major city and doesn't understand like what black culture is, that he might have some questions about things or not understand the way or let's remove race from the situation. How do you perceive the police when you live in a small town versus how do you perceive the police when you live in a major metropolitan area? Right. And this is and if you can't entertain those ideas, then please stop spreading your opinion, because you're not doing a service to anybody. If you want to have an open mind and you want to have a conversation, then that's fantastic. And by the way, don't listen to people who put that out there too. A lot of times people will send me stuff that's like, oh, did you see this? I'm like, yes, somebody is always going to say something stupid about everything. There you go. I solved your problem for you. Somebody is always going to say something stupid about everything. So please, for the love of God, don't just send me every last little inane thing that somebody says. Let's work to find the real thing that we're actually fighting against.
Yeah, the interpretation of the police it's certainly poignant to me and you because we live in Minneapolis and Chicago, respectively. And right now, as we're recording in the middle of April 2021, we're currently going through the Derek Chauvin trial. There have been major police shootings, or one shooting and one attempted arrest that ended in the death of the arrestee. Like within the last,
there was one here too.
Yeah, I'm talking about the little kid.
Yeah,
the little
Adam
kid
Toledo.
And I posted about, actually I reposted something that Spike Cohen posted about the kid in Chicago. What was his name?
Adam Toledo.
Okay. And someone commented, but there was a gun at the scene. And I'm like, what does that matter? Was the kid had his hands up and the gun was not anywhere near him. Like, even if there's a reason the cops say, drop your weapon and put your hands up, like the point of saying that is so that they don't have to shoot you. And that's my interpretation of the cops coming from, someone who grew up in a big city and has lived in another big city for his entire adult life.
Yeah.
I think I lived in a suburb for 6 months. But other than that, like I've only ever known the police as like an adversarial force. I think this person who it was interesting in this conversation I had with this person. I said, look, I have a feeling if this were a post about like what was the name of the family that they were occupying some national park office or something like that.
Oh, the Bundy family.
Yeah, the Bundys, or maybe the Branch Davidians, or the guy in the hotel that was gunned down.
Not Duncan Lemp. His name was Adam Shaber.
Yeah, but also Duncan Lemp. And it's not a race thing. It's just you can sympathize with these people because you're a middle-aged white person who lives in the suburbs or a rural area. And you don't think that the same person, when George Floyd died last year, was trying to come up with all these reasons. Yeah, he beat a pregnant woman, and he had all these drugs in his system, and like all of this stuff that to me is not germane to the conversation of whether the police officer was acting in a justifiable manner. And
this is the way in which people interact with these things like a spectator sport. Right. And listen, all the well for it. People who want to interact with these big ideas as a spectator sport are going to be the people who fund our endeavors here. You and Blackbird, me at beenawake.com. That's the truth of the matter, right? I think part of what we're seeing with podcasting is a rise of a new sense-making network that is akin, again, allegorically speaking, to the rise of spectator sports. So I don't have any final thoughts on that, but it's been something I've been thinking about lately, in the context of our conversation and like continuing to have conversations and all these other interesting people that I'm meeting doing this show. But I want to hone in on a couple other things you said. First is what I've been hitting a lot is racism in America is the oldest and most persistent method of social control. It does not matter which way that racism is flowing, whether we are hating blacks today, whether we are hating Mexicans, whether we are hating Asians, whether we are hating Europeans, whites, doesn't matter. Racism is the oldest and most persistent method of social control. The people in power who are using a racial narrative and this includes people in government and people in the media and people in academia. And I won't say the boogie word. I won't say the boogie word of cathedral. Oops. But like, that is what we are experiencing. It is a method of social control. These people are not serious. They do not care about you. They do not care about your children. They don't care about your race, for that matter. It's a method of social control, and it's used to continually divide people. To the extent that this is prevalent in the cops, I wrote an article last week where I said, what obesity and sloth mean for your rights? And I had four simple questions. Why is it that the police are not expected to maintain a high level of physical health? Why are police departments not churning out de-escalation machines? If it's such a stressful job, why don't you select for people who have a strong mental health? And why don't you make mental health a priority for the people who are there? And and I can't remember the fourth one off the top of my head, but it's basically just another play on that. And it's this, so, okay, let's remove all the political spectator sport of it and let's actually hone in on what we're talking about here, right? Which is I think the libertarians do very well, but they get caught up in the spectator sport as well of things. The reason why we have issues with the police is because there is no incentive to fix the police because of the monopolistic nature of police departments. And the people in power can push a racial narrative that is the same. I mean, how many posts have you seen? Because I've seen them of saying, my grandmother was marching for this. Why are we still having the same march? Well, part of that is because you keep electing the same kinds of people with the same kinds of ideas. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because your thought leaders as such are more interested in controlling your mind than they are giving you an understanding and taking that Christian notion of reconciliation and forgiveness and applying that in a secular sense.
Yeah, newsflash. I mean, you might have voted for Kamala Harris for Attorney General of California because she was a woman of color and looked like you and may have had an upbringing like yours. Mm-hmm. But I mean, she's no different. I don't want to use internal jargon, but mm-hmm. she's no different from if she had been a white male prosecutor with absolutely no sympathy for Black people in practice.
Right.
And now she's the person who's in charge of American immigration policy. Mm-hmm. Do you think she's gonna do your bidding as the immigration czar? Of course not.
Well, so what the Marxists have always believed, and I don't know how comfortable you are. I'm very comfortable with talking about Marxism and communism. I think that there's that, anybody who eschews that, I think, is not an honest actor in many respects. One way in which the Marxists disagree with the liberal tradition, broadly speaking. And I do, and sorry to the monarchists out there, but I do think of myself still in that broader tradition. Maybe in the way that Socrates thought of himself as a member of Athens, just to make that very complicated for the people who will follow that. The fourth question, by the way, is if you can't run a mile, how can you keep the peace, right? That's a very practical question. If you can't run a mile, how can you possibly expect to be keeping the peace in these situations? And the idea is these people are not trained properly and there's no incentive to make it better. And in fact, they're asked to, and then, if you want to layer on top of that, they're asked to enforce immoral laws. What the Marxists have always believed is that there is a fundamental difference between the oppressor and the oppressed class. This isn't to say that class analysis isn't useful, but it is to say that that is a fundamental mistake. There are different psychopathies within individuality, but overall, we kind of can all, at least those of us who are enough awake to understand this sort of thing, who are conscious enough, if you will, to understand the darker aspects of our nature. This Jungian idea of integrating the shadow. You can understand that there is a dark side to who you are as a person. We have. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I'd like to think everybody has done things that they regret in their life and not necessarily for the wrong reasons. And when you look at someone like Kamala Harris, what these people are doing in the media is saying, see, look, she is a Black woman, half Black, wasn't raised in the United States, very, Berkeley parents, upper middle class upbringing, probably better than me. But she's a Black woman.
I had no idea that was the case. I had no idea that was the case. Because of the debate shot she took at Joe Biden about being the girl that was bussed, and then the T-shirt that her campaign sold. I just kind of figured she was raised in a lower middle class to lower class African American or mixed race.
Her dad was Black. Her parents met at Berkeley. This is my understanding. I could be wrong. I don't follow these things super closely. But her mom was an Indian immigrant. Her dad, I believe, was a Jamaican immigrant. And her grandfather owned slaves in Jamaica as a Black man, is my understanding. And her mom left her dad when she was young. And so she was raised by her Indian immigrant mother in Canada for a lot of her life and kind of came back to the US to be educated as an adult.
Boy.
Which is interesting when you kind of consider, Barack Obama as an interesting allegory to that as well. And this isn't a criticism of these people, and it has nothing to do with the form of their race. This is the point, though, is they can be presented by people in the media, in academia, saying, see, look, they are going to be something different. Right now in Chicago, we have a openly gay Black woman as our mayor. You understand? An openly gay Black woman as the mayor. And they're still calling for her to retire, for her to resign. And if you talk to the hardcore activists, they don't like her either. So it's the form of the person is accidental, right? This is one of the reasons why I think Like myself personally, I don't care. I'll have the conversation about race. I'll have the conversation about gender because I've done the work of kind of knowing my heart, and I'm not so I was bullied enough as a kid to where I'm not going to be bullied out of having a conversation now, especially when I can have like a platform where I can espouse ideas that I think will help people. And the helpful thing is to realize that when somebody tells you, well, you should feel really good. You should feel really good about electing a black woman to vice president of the United States. They're trying to control you. They don't actually care about you. They don't care about the life that you're going to live. They're trying to control you so that they can keep getting more power and they can keep amassing their own personal fortunes. And like, there's nothing wrong with amassing a personal fortune, but don't do it on the backs of lies, and don't do it on the backs of putting innocent people in jail. Can we have that as a standard?
Yeah. Let's get back into the kind of bigger picture philosophical stuff. So Thad Russell, of whom I'm a big fan,
Same,
considers himself a postmodernist. And the way that he kind of defines that in shorthand is he's an agnostic in all things, similar to the way that you say you question everything. On the other hand, so that's one kind of, when I thought skeptic before hearing you, that was one thing that I thought of when I heard that word. Another thing that I thought of when I heard that word was, especially kind of between Jordan Peterson's rise and Donald Trump's presidency, there was a real popular like YouTube quote unquote community called the Skeptic Community, and it had people like the Armored Skeptic and Sargon of Akkad and all these kind of like mostly anonymous people who called themselves skeptics. And they're very different from Thad Russell because they're kind of dogmatic in their skepticism. And then the third thing that I thought of when I thought skeptic was like Rational Wiki. And I think, and maybe like lesswrong.com, that kind of thing, where they're like hyper rationalist and also dogmatic about that. And, you know, I think, oh God, what's his name? Jason Alexander, Scott Alexander, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, I mean the Slate Star Codex guy. These kind of three communities were what I thought of skepticism, and you're a little bit different from all three of them, but you kind of merge all three. Do you consider them fellow travelers of you? I mean, I can't imagine that the skeptic community, quote unquote, is any different from any other quote unquote community in that they have like the no true Scotsman thing. I mean, you know, we're libertarians, so we know all about that.
Yeah.
Is there like, oh, you're not really a skeptic in those circles, or do you not even travel in those circles? Are you more aloof?
I think I'm more aloof in that respect, because I have this like weird intellectual journey across multiple universities, and then, you know, not actually making it into post-grad for reasons that I'll tell one day. And, you know, it's those interesting things. I mean, there was a time in my life where I thought I was going to be in the Army. There was a time in my life where I thought I was going to be a university professor. Now I'm at this point where I don't know where I'm going, but it might actually have to do something with war and something with being a professor and still teaching. But to answer your question, I think one thing that I have, we talked a little bit and when you came on my show about my conceptualization of the paradox of identity, which, to be fair to everybody listening, if you disagree with that, I haven't quite spelled it out just yet. But effectively, it's this thing of, okay, so we have this word, skepticism, and it can mean different things to different people, including some really good things and some really bad things, right? Saying, you know, you can do this with the word Christian, with the word libertarian, with the word Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, progressive, so on and so forth. So what part of that is why when I do an interview with somebody, I ask, how do you self-identify? This is why I'm so interested in the idea of identity, because I think we live in a time where for people who are conscious enough to realize it, they can actually choose who they are as a person. They can choose their identity far more than you ever could in history. If you live in a town of 500 people and you're the one outsider, and that's all you can ever know, you're not going to last very long, or you're going to become like the hermit, right? Who kind of exists outside, or the old man who people mock, right? Because we're apes, you know, we're freaking apes, man. And we're these mimetic creatures that will copy what's around us. Whereas like I know you have it, and I know a lot of people who are listening have this as well, where you are in a situation with people you care about, who you have a relationship with, and you're like, oh, I can't say that. Like, oh, I shouldn't talk like this right now. Like, I have to move myself out of this mode of speaking. Like, I have to do it. I've become pretty good about doing it as a consequence of having the show, because that's kind of my outlet now, where it's like, okay, hey, if you want to hear these thoughts, this is where you can go for it. And then as a consequence of of work, right? But there's like work me who isn't going to bring up these deep topics, and then there's me who is. And and with the internet and the fact that like you and I can connect across hundreds of miles, and like literally just being, oh, we had a friend, Jose Galison was the guy who told me to reach out to you. And it's like, okay, for sure, I'm going to reach out to him and talk to him. And then we can have this really fundamental conversation. And I've done that in my personal life. Like, my closest friends are all people who I can have these kinds of conversations with, because this is kind of who I am as a person. Would I be this same person if I lived 1,000 years ago? I don't think so. Now, how is this traced to ancient astronaut theory? Well, what they will argue is that these people, and I think there's a truth to this, these people were almost, if not just as intelligent as we were. They were just lacking technical capability and the language with which to understand things that they were perceiving. And so this is Mark Twain tried to answer this question in his book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Right? Like, it's an age-old question. If you dropped somebody from 100 years ago to today, what would be the toughest thing to explain to them? What would it be? I do think there's something to be said for the fact that an individual dropped in a different country at a different time would actually look different than how they do dropped in America in the 21st century. And I've kind of forgotten what your initial question was, how it relates and how it goes through. So that's where I start. Is I try to take people at their word. And that's where I start. And I'm not somebody who will say, well, obviously you're not an atheist because you agree with me on all these things about morality. So therefore, you can't be an atheist because an atheist is without morality. That's not a sufficient. And same thing with like, oh, well, you can't really be a Christian because you're such a rational person. And only an irrational person would accept a God into their life, or accept that somebody is their personal Lord and Savior. Mm. And there is, and I think that encompasses a lot more human thought that like exists at a certain level, to where it doesn't matter how it manifests itself. And this is what I mean when I say the paradox of identity, is there are those people who will be Christian and be really, really bad Christians, just as there are people who are atheists and will be really, really bad atheists, in whatever sense you want to understand that. And yet, are we going to say that if I'm a Christian, I'm going to say that those atheists are representative of the whole, the bad ones. And then if I'm an atheist, I'm going to say those bad Christians are representative of the whole, right? So it doesn't matter if I will talk about the wonderful priests I've met in my life. You're always going to bring up the one that raped you, and rightly so, right? And so we have to kind of struggle with this in this conversation that exists across millions of people in an instantaneous way, where you have to just react to a story and you don't actually get to process it. Which now that I'm doing active content is really something I've been pondering. Like one of the articles that I haven't written yet is like, what the hell is a second thought? And why do we have this concept of second thoughts? Right? Like, because I had a personal instance where I was dating somebody, and then I started to have second thoughts. And that's what I was thinking about. And then it was like, wait, why do we have this conception of a second thought? Why is it a second thought and not a third? How does this, it's just this, trying to understand is also, I think, a difference for me. Like, I talk about setting truth aside, and I talk about understanding and expression. So I try to understand people when I'm doing things the best way I know how. I'm trying to understand somebody's position so that I can express my position in opposition to that. And I don't know that makes me a good philosopher. I don't know that's going to make me, that would make me a good politician, and thank God for that. But I like to think it makes me somebody worth listening to. If I could be so bold as to say something like that.
So earlier you said that there's no truth, there's nihilism, and nihilism is boring. Mm-hmm. So, okay, let's grant that. Let's grant that there is such thing as truth. Mm-hmm. Do you think that with all the variables that exist, that truth is knowable?
No, that's why I'm a skeptic.
Yeah. So you can dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, and you'll never get to the bottom. Do you think?
I would say that yes. No, I don't know. I can't answer that in affirmative. Maybe there will be a day where we understand everything. But I would say that if if truth is a matter of putting the right words in the right order, we would have figured it out already. And of course, this is where somebody would say, well, that is what the Bible is, right? That is what the Quran is. That is what the teachings of Buddha are. That I can't think of the Hindu text off the top of my head. Bhagavad Gita, something like that.
Bhagavad Gita, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I only remember that from a Beatles song, to be honest.
It's like I can see the letters in my mind and I can think of the sounds, but I can't get the consonants right, which is frankly what happens a lot to me with Indian words. But do you know that Hindu itself, just talking about how like politics corrupts this stuff and changes the way that that Hindu itself was a classification created by the British government?
You're kidding me. What?
No. So it was a way for them to distinguish. It was a way for them to distinguish the Muslim population in the Indian subcontinent from the non-Muslim population. Because in my study of religion, there's a couple textbooks on my shelf that kind of go over this, but it's actually like Santana Dharma. What does Santana Dharma mean? It means followers of the way. Have you ever heard that before, James? In your studies of religion?
Yeah, no.
Early Christians called themselves the followers of the way. So Hinduism was actually this very loosely organized school of thought before British imperialism and British colonialism. It is my understanding, and I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but just the fact that we will use this term Hinduism to describe a religion that I don't think it actually captures, again, from my perspective, what these people, what many of the practitioners and believers actually, follow. So, but it was created as a classification method, which is just like, again, when we're going back to sex and gender, and like, is this just an accident? Is this accidental distinction between a word we get from a Germanic language and a word we get from a Romantic language? Now this huge debate, right?
So I guess to kind of start winding down, you mentioned a lot of philosophers who are now dead. Who are some of your influencers who just today you like follow on Twitter or listen to their podcast or read their books or whatever?
Yeah. So I am probably not. I don't know that I would call that. None of them are necessary. Well, all right. So sorry. The reason for this consternation is, I wrote a piece like, who is a philosopher? Who can call themselves a philosopher? I am probably more influenced by people who are dead than people who are living. There's something to be said for that, I think. But like people that I follow today that kind of, I think, deal with this stuff in, greater or lesser extents are people like Jordan Peterson. That would probably be one person I can think of off the bat. I think Thaddeus Russell does this well, even though he takes more of a historical approach to the exploration of ideas. And I don't know that he'd call himself a philosopher. And then, frankly, I do like Stefan Molyneux. I think he has a lot of interesting things to say. And I'm not even going to do the quibble thing where I say I disagree with some of what he has to say. And I think
that drives me nuts. I think we need to denormalize that particular disclaimer. Mm-hmm. Just saying I don't agree with everything anybody says. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't have to say that about Dave Smith. Why should I have to say that about Stefan Molyneux?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm trying, and like, I'm even like that's, it's like, well, I like Stefan Molyneux. Like, and frankly, and I'll give a little bit of a testimonial. That man has helped me in the realm of like self-knowledge and understanding. And like, cause I use philosophy to try and understand myself, right? I'm never somebody whose therapy has really worked for. I've always felt that I can like run circles around the therapists that I've met. That's not a condemnation of therapy. It's a condemnation of therapists that I've interacted with, right? And I've never really gone to therapy on my own free will. So not that I was ever institutionalized, for the record, but I think he takes that methodology of philosophy has to have ramifications for your personal life, and that you should live a happy life. And you should understand that there are people who have tried to hurt you, and that maybe they're the reasons why you're not living your best life. I will say that since he has moved off of politics after he was deplatformed, he's probably a lot closer to the person that everybody fell in love with. I kind of came across him in his rise of politics, and I look at him as a cautionary tale, frankly, as somebody who's getting involved in politics with the mind and the rhetoric of a philosopher. But, again, I don't really care what you think about that, because the people that aren't going to look at this with an open mind I'm not that interested. They were going to demonize me anyway for something that I've said in our conversation so far. I'm trying to think of other people that spike to mind. I mean, in general, because there's this like philosophical stuff that I do, which is more of like training your brain to look at things in a certain way. But then I'm also really interested in like mindset and, being a better, like trying to make yourself a better person, trying to grow your sense of autonomy and your sense of wealth. And for that, I go to Jason Stapleton. And he's been, we kind of talked about that a little bit on the last show of just having somebody to push you in your career is something that is super important, whatever that career is. Like, part of the reason why I'm doing this is I would love for this to be my main source of income. I would love the idea that my words are so good that people want to pay me. And if you want to do that, you can go to beenawake.com/subscribe. I'm offering a lifetime discount for anybody who joins my Substack before the 1-year anniversary of my first published date. But even if it's not, there's still the skills that you learn to develop your career are transportable to everything. And for those of us who want to listen to podcasts and don't want to watch network news, we kind of understand the way the world is changing. And so you should understand as a consequence of that, you need to be in a position to make sure that you're set up so that you can support your loved ones or even just yourself so that you're not a burden on society and you're not a burden on people in your lives. And so I think, I don't know, I guess I would say in totality, I kind of take it all, but I think I've been meaning to reach out to try to find more people in this space, but then it's an input-output thing. So if I start listening to current people who are kind of at a similar level to me, am I putting something out there that's just the same as them? And then I don't have anything unique to say.
Yeah, that's what Monica Perez, who is a big influencer of mine, that's why she doesn't listen to libertarian podcasts. She wants to make sure that she's, original and not spouting out somebody else's thought. I, on the other hand, relish the fact that I don't really have any original contributions, although that might change. I've been toying with some ideas. Okay, great. So you've mentioned beenawake.com/subscribe. Are there other places where you'd like people to go to find you, or is that the best?
If you go to beenawake.com, that's how you can find me everywhere. You can go to follow.beenawake.com if you'd like. Follow it, beenawake.com/donate if you want to do a one-time donation. You can find me on social media at the LB Muniz. That's MUNIZ for all you gringos out there. So yeah, I mean, you can catch me on the most, if you want to see me in a completely different vein, but still, putting on a good show, you can catch my recent appearance on the Tower Gang Power podcast, which is kind of more of a raunchy, not safe for work conversation about towers on Twitter, which was fun.
Who hosts that? I think I am following a couple of the people, but I didn't know.
Anarcho Toad. You should totally try and get on with them because I think you would have some fun.
Yeah, I was in the Tower Gang for a minute.
And not to belabor the point, but this is an interesting question of in groups and out groups, right? This like can you take a little bit of offense? And I think that's one of the reasons why I want to do a show like that is because I'm really not interested in an audience that can't take a little bit of offense. Because again, like I said earlier, I was bullied a lot as a kid, and my mom's answer wasn't, no, cry about it, get on. My mom's answer was to go to the school and say, if you don't solve this problem, he is going to punch them the next time that they make fun of him, and you are going to suspend him, and I am going to take him to get ice cream. And so I don't really care I don't care for bullies. So I'm not really interested in people who want to bully me about their stupid morality. So that's why I think there's a utility in this space that we're in. We didn't get into it, but which is fine. It's like the larger libertarian party space where if you can't take a little bit of offense, you need to. And if you can't take a little bit of offense, you shouldn't be in the realm of ideas, and you shouldn't be thinking that your opinion has merit.
Yeah, I think we should leave it there. I really appreciate the time, LB.
Oh yeah, man.
And
this is a blast.
I might try to get on that Tower Gang podcast. I'm looking at their faces right now, and a few of them are familiar to me. Mm-hmm. I don't know who Drew's husband is, but
that's Nick Ashley.
Oh,
he's Individualist podcast.
Oh yeah. Okay, mm-hmm. I just didn't recognize him by face. Yeah, cool. Well, I've heard of him for sure. I think he's been on a few different higher profile podcasts. So, all right, cool. Well, I appreciate it again, and let's talk again soon.
Hell yeah, man.
All right, thanks again to LB for joining me today, and thank you, as always, for tuning in. Remember, you can find LB at beenawake.substack.com. I will make sure to link to his show in the show notes. It's a fantastic podcast and also newsletter that I think you need to subscribe to with your email address to get the full effect. Additionally, I think that in order to get the full effect of this show, you know I'm going to say it, you should subscribe with your email address at blackbird.substack.com if you haven't already. Of course, you can subscribe to just the podcast in your favorite podcast app like iTunes or Spotify. But for the full Blackbird experience, make sure that you sign up with your email address so that you also get my written content. And you will also have the opportunity to sign up for the premium feed, which will get you, obviously, premium content as that is released. So thanks again for tuning in for this episode, and I will see you on the next one. Until then, live free.